Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at facebook.com/virtual memories show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can always promote us by telling people about the Virtual Memories Show on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Happy post-Memorial Day. I took it pretty easy for the long weekend, just reading a couple of books for upcoming shows, editing this episode, and binging on the current season of The Americans before the series finale this week. My wife and I had kind of put it off for a while and ran through all 9 episodes between Friday and Sunday. Looking forward to it. Don't want to even guess at what's going to come down, but it'll be interesting to seeing how they wrap it up after 6 seasons. Sticking the landing's kind of difficult for shows, and it's one of those things where people try to act like the ending of a show isn't as important anymore because there's such a heavy weight on these TV as art series. But still, we'll see what they do. Now, I did get around to recording a bonus episode of the show on Saturday morning. I had some thoughts about Philip Roth's passing. Philip Roth's death. I hate passing. I think it's a silly euphemism. And the fact that I never pitched Philip Roth on doing the show, even though he's the person I most wanted to sit down and record with. And then I move on to the memorial service for Sandy McClatchy, the great poet who I did get to record with in 2015. It's only 15 minutes, but it is all me. So it's in the on the website. It's in the iTunes listings. It's 2018 Memorial Day bonus mini episode. If you want to hear 15 minutes of me talking about that sort of stuff, feel free. Anyway, I have some crazy business travel coming next week, so it was good to have a little downtime now. There's also lots of other stuff I don't want to talk to you about, so let's dive into this week's show. Now, our guest this time is Christopher Brown. He generally goes by Chris in conversation, but I imagine he sticks with the full-length name in print so as not to be confused with the R&B singer. Anyway, Chris's first book is Tropic of Kansas from Harper Voyager, and I loved it. It's a dystopian novel set in a counterfactual America that is falling to pieces, but is not that different than the one we live in. It reminded me of just some of my favorite novels and some of my favorite writers from my college years onwards, but not in any sort of nostalgic or cheap way. Chris is really inventive. The novel is contemporary. It's not the 80s or 90s. It's thrilling. It's an absolute page turner, and it's a very, very thoughtful book about the redemption behind dystopia. The Tropic of Kansas is split between these two main characters, one of whom is this unwitting underground rebel. The other's a lawyer who kind of finds herself choosing to resist and entering that world. I don't want to tell you too much about it because a lot of the thrill is in sort of uncovering the world that Chris has created. It is, as he points out, a novel of flyover country, which is also kind of different than a lot of novels I tend to read. But it is a joy. Tropic of Kansas is really one of those novels I'm so happy to have discovered. And I discovered it because of this show. I met Chris at a science fiction panel that was moderated by Henry Wessels, who was a recent guest at the Grolier Club. Henry was on the show because of this exhibition he'd put together of his science fiction collection, and Tropic of Kansas is one of the late novels that he added to the to the collection and the book that came along with it. And Chris was one of the few panelists that night who I hadn't recorded with yet, because the other ones were Henry and Samuel Delaney and John Crowley and Ellen Datlow, as well as Siobhan Carroll and Maria Headley, who I also haven't recorded with. But anyway, Henry praised Christopher's novel pretty highly, and since Chris is coming up for a visit from Texas a few weeks after the panel, he became part of my insane 4 guests in 3 boroughs in one day event a few Saturdays ago. Now, as caveats go for this one, Chris was the 3rd episode that day. And I will not try and sugarcoat this. I was already starting to drag a little. My voice isn't great. I wish I was a little sharper with my questions. On the plus side, I think Chris is going to be at ReaderCon in July up in Boston, so maybe we'll do a follow-up there from some of the questions I kind of thought about. Now, here's a short bio of Chris from the Harper's website. There's a longer version at ChristopherBrown.com, and I suggest you go to the website and read it. Christopher Brown was nominated for a World Fantasy Award for the anthology 3 Messages and a Warning, Contemporary Mexican Short Stories of the Fantastic. His short fiction has appeared in a variety of magazines and anthologies, including MIT Technology Review's 12 Tomorrows, The Baffler, and Stories for Chip. He lives in Austin, Texas. Tropic of Kansas is his first novel. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Christopher Brown.
This is reading Neuromancer. I think, as a young guy was sort of what more than anything, that and reading Ballard is what turned me on into the idea of doing something like this. So,
which I guess we should launch back into at this very moment. Talk about getting started in SF. What started you as a reader and as a writer?
I started as a reader at the time. There's my good friend, the late David Hartwell, had that famous aphorism in his History of Science Fiction: The Golden Age of Science Fiction is 11.
Oh, okay.
And and that was true of me, I suppose. Mm-hmm. I started reading, science fiction and fantasy as a kid, as a kind of a pre-adolescent, and read it all through high school, and then I drifted away from it. Once I finished high school, with exceptions. I started reading Ballard. I started reading Lovecraft, and I started reading some of the cyberpunks, the ones that kind of came on my radar screen. But I wasn't clued into fandom. I didn't really sort of read canonically in the oeuvre, right?
Did you know about Science Fiction Eye, the magazine? Or not?
I started to come across that later, right? And, I was living a sort of wonky existence. I was reading a lot of crime and noir and reading a lot of Walker Percy and, certain sorts of, kind of contemporary American writers, or they were contemporary then. And in any event, but I started writing, and I always had this idea of writing something in a kind of Ballardian vein, or in a kind of post-cyberpunk vein, I suppose. But the things I was doing weren't really science fictional in their setting, per se, right? And but when I moved to Austin, I got plugged in with a group of folks that led me to being part of the Turkey City Writers Workshop, which was something that Bruce Sterling had run. And this is There isn't, I guess there is, but there isn't really a school you can go to learn to be a science fiction writer.
No, you sort of have the Clarion thing, but that's when you're already a science fiction writer.
And exactly. To know about Clarion, you need to know about fandom. You need to know about that community. And in any event, I had met the writer Don Webb, this brilliant writer, best known for his short fiction in Austin, who's been in Austin since the 80s. And through him, I met Bruce and got involved with Turkey City. And Turkey City had been around since the 70s, kind of one of the longest running, science fiction workshops around in the Milford style, where, invented by Damon Knight, where, you have sort of a dozen people sitting around a table and everybody brings something new, preferably short, that they're working on. And you go around and check your ego at the door round table. And in kind of 3 or 4 years of doing that, I really sort of got more and more excited about the possibilities of science fiction, or about marrying more explicitly the tools of science fiction with what I was trying to do, which sort of straddled that and sort of, in maybe the political thriller. And that ultimately led me here.
And you get asked this a bunch, I'm sure, in the past year since it's come out, but writing Tropic of Kansas before this current presidential administration, and yet semi sort of predicting the world that we're living in now. We know science fiction isn't meant as a predictive thing, but what were the threads that, if you consider this novel a thought experiment, which I think you've said, what was the experiment, and what were the influences, and what were you looking at exploring through this novel?
I mean, it's funny, the idea that it's predictive or seen by some people as prescient or topical, perhaps, because in fact, I was like actively running away from topicality.
Yeah.
Because to me, topicality for a writer, especially, for anybody trying to write anything of any length, it's going to take a period of time to get into print.
Yeah.
Topicality is really a double-edged sword, and I was interested in writing a kind of a post 9/11 novel that took some of the things I love about adventure fiction and adventure pulps, and coupled them with the material of kind of the post 9/11 techno thriller, and tried to subvert it towards more emancipatory ends. And I realized as I started working on that the way I needed to do that would be to ultimately to take a kind of alternate history, funhouse mirror approach to do what I wanted to do. I set out to sort of explore what would happen if the revolutions that we saw going on over the past decade in other parts of the world were going on here. And for that to occur, it needed to be a kind of a very different reality than the one in which we exist. And so ended up imagining, the circumstances in which that kind of a revolution could occur in the contemporary United States, and undertake doing what I think a number of other writers have done recently as well, and all in very different ways, but sort of take the things going on in the Middle East in the past 15, 20 years and sort of put some of them here. And the idea of the charismatic CEO president was sort of riffing, I suppose, topically on things I saw in the landscape if I look back on it. I mean, the idea is hardly a new one.
Oh, that was what Bush Jr. ran as.
Yeah.
He was going to be CEO of America Incorporated.
Yeah, and even his father. His father ran as, the kind of Greenwich prep turned, Texas self-made guy who only had a few $1 million of startup capital, right? But that kind of idea of the entrepreneurial president and that notion certainly was there with Mitt Romney, the Olympics turnaround guy brought in as the American turnaround guy. That was kind of the narrative. And that idea that has a certain reflexive appeal, especially to people of a kind of more business-oriented political bent, that the best qualification, surely the best qualification to run a big country is to run a big company. And having in my day job life spent a lot of time working inside corporations and a fair bit of time working in politics, I knew that what an interesting notion that was. And if you kind of take that from a speculative fictional point of view and sort of carry it out to its logical extreme, I mean, corporations are not democracies; they're dictatorships, and so that was the genesis of that idea.
And a private business like the one our current president runs is even more dictatorial along those terms, at least in terms of not having to report out to shareholders.
Right. The idea of being able to govern reality without any fiduciary duty to anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I concluded years ago that CEOs can actually do almost nothing positive. In very few instances do you get a CEO who positively guided a company. Most everything is either cruising along, or they make a decision that turns out to be absolutely disastrous, or they just don't sink the ship, and that's good enough.
It's true. I mean, I've spent.
You've been on the inside of these things.
Yeah, I mean, both. I've been. I've spent a lot of my career working around power. I suppose. I'm a lawyer, and the sort of lawyer who has worked in boardrooms and in cloakrooms, and working around power, you become very I don't know. For me, you become very suspicious of the efficacy of the kinds of power pyramids that really govern our society in most circles. And that was another part of this book, was really, critiquing the experience of working around CEOs and seeing how the power structures, especially of those kinds of systems of localized governance, tend to indulge some of the worst qualities of human behavior, and certainly perpetuate these kind of, silverback, primitive pirate band warlord rule structures of governance that I don't think are really what I hope the future looks like.
Reminds me of Jack Welch, being the great hero, the General Electric guy, and looking back, they're now restating. Yeah, well, actually, they were kind of fudging numbers for decades to hit these earnings targets, and maybe he wasn't as great a CEO as he thought. Although I always throw the great Jack Welch moment after he'd retired and was going to publish the next great book that was going to change business teaching and CEO understanding. Came out September 11th, 2001, and managed to sink without a trace. So it was one of those moments where I thought, as much as a guy champions Six Sigma and controlling everything in his world, sometimes the outside world can come down on you and destroy all your plans pretty effectively.
Well, there's this idea that you see it really manifest in our contemporary politics in a way. And I did a lot of this research actually after I wrote the book, sort of thinking more deeply about this idea of the charismatic CEO as our sort of paradigmatic contemporary American leader figure. And it turned out that there are all these management theorists who've done all this research into that figure, and it sort of dates back to the rise of the individual investor and of a kind of a different approach to corporate governance, and the idea of that American business in the 60s and 70s was dominated by these kinds of insider cabals of elites that had sort of degenerated and become self-dealing. And so you bring in the transformational change agent, the single charismatic individual who can make it all better. And we've seen these figures, over and over again over the past couple of decades, and then you see that what the data shows.
No, the numbers were totally fake, and
the numbers are often fake. That these figures most often left the organization crippled, and enriched themselves in the process, and often through chicanery and creative accounting, and and I think trying to interrogate that part of how we manage to run ourselves in the context of trying to think about what does a healthier and more participatory version of democracy look like is kind of, in some ways, the political core of the novel.
Yeah. If you consider it a thought experiment, what were the results?
You know, the most interesting thing about this to me was, in part, it's a thought experiment in sort of creating this counterfactual and then trying to and creating this very dystopian counterfactual, and then trying to kind of find my way or have my characters find the way to a more utopian alternative, or at least a more aspirational alternative. And to get to there, I mean, I don't know if I got all the way there. I feel like I kind of got to where you could see it from there.
Same with Moses.
Huh?
Same with Moses.
Yeah. I don't know if I'll compare myself to him, but I ended up really finding myself focused in on ecological themes is the sort of the heart of the matter. And it ended up migrating from something that felt like futurism to some kind of atemporal Anthropocene thing where I came to see, and maybe it was a function of, you know, my own living environment, but and other things that were going on as I was working on the book, but that for these characters, most of the social and economic and political problems with which they're grappling are really rooted in the damaged relationship that the society in which they live has with the land on which the people live. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the Tropic of Kansas of the title is a geographic place, among other things. It's not a real place, but one that is sort of manifest out there on the other side of the kind of the mirage at the end of the highway. And it's sort of, you know, remarking on things I saw in the landscape while I was working on the book, and that became sort of more evident as you saw people doing the sort of post-mortem of our last national election, of sort of looking at the parts of the landscape that have been kind of left behind or exhausted by overuse. And
my in-laws are Bayou, Louisiana. Mm-hmm. You know, my wife's family, it's about, I don't know, 40 miles southwest of New Orleans, and seeing not just, you know, what happens to the environment, but that the day-to-day people's lives, you know, tied into working for Union Carbide and companies like that. That's, you know, You can't just say, oh, we need a new utopia here. You're all out of jobs. You know, there's a more complex reality.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, this book, the characters travel kind of through the heart of flyover country from north to south over the course of the book. And they go to places that, imaginary versions of places that I've spent a lot of time in and traveling along routes I've traveled. And, you know, and you see the way in which, especially as it ages, you know, there's as we're taping this, there's a big Grant Wood retrospective up at the Whitney, I believe it is. And, you know, that vision of America that's represented in those paintings of this sort of bounteous core of the American continent, where the strongest values of the, you know, Crevecoeur's American farmer are kind of, you know, most expressed with the most fidelity. But you travel through those areas now, and you see this once beautiful landscape that was plowed under by those guys when they came through and, you know, tore out all the timber and put the prairies under the plow and devastated the landscape, an area where, you know, the entire water system is incredibly sick, not just in Flint, but kind of all through, you know, between the Missouri River and the Ohio River valleys, and where the only kind of agricultural production that's really viable anymore is, you know, really large scale, almost roboticized, and certainly biotechnologically facilitated industrial modes of production that depopulate the landscape, denaturalize the landscape, and leave a pretty apocalyptic landscape that's really right there in the here and now.
Yeah. What was your upbringing? That, were you from flyover country? What was your
I
childhood?
grew up in Des Moines, Iowa.
That would do it.
Kind of a funny place. I mean, it's a place where
I don't think anyone's ever used that term before for Des Moines, but I'm just kidding.
Well, as I was growing up in Des Moines, in the 70s, the slogan they adopted, the municipal slogan that they adopted and erected by the airport was Des Moines, the surprising place, which is an unlikely name for what's essentially a city of actuaries.
They have everything down to the numbers.
and it's a place where they recently discovered the true origin of the name Des Moines, which in French means, some monks, perhaps. There was the notion that maybe it was a sort of a misspelling by Anglos of Des Moines, of the middle, because it's a middle river. But it turned out that when Joliet and his exploration partner were exploring the upper reaches of the Mississippi, they were down near contemporary Peoria, Illinois, at the juncture of the Des Moines River, where it comes into the Mississippi. And they asked some of these local Indians, the Peoria Indians, who lives up that way. And they gave them the name in their language, which was something like the Moingona, which an archaeologist and anthropologist recently figured out means the shitheads or the shit eaters. And so as a native of the town, that was sort of a particularly revelatory anecdote. But
it explains so much about my life. Yeah.
But and I think the Midwest, growing up in the Midwest, is something that brews a couple of things. One is it brews it's a ready-made environment, or an environment conducive to trying to make up more interesting versions of reality. Mm-hmm. And so one that contributes greatly, I think, to the kind of the fantastic approach to a kind of imaginative experience of life. You're either going to add things to it or take things out of it and take a more kind of abstract, minimalist approach. And it also produces a kind of weird, earnest irony. There's this sort of simultaneous sarcasm, or kind of dry, a kind of a dryness to the humor, at the same time as there is this kind of reflexively Boy Scout quality, or Girl Scout quality. Or now it's just Scouts. Thankfully, we finally reached that point. Mm-hmm. And and you'll hear it in I hear it in the music, and I see it in a lot of the works that I consider Midwestern, which are not often even categorized as such. But I've also been living in Texas for 20 years now, mm-hmm. and spent time on the East Coast. But sort of that travels between Texas and the Midwest are a part of the engine of this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talk about where you live now, because one of your peers described it to me as a accidental wilderness preserve, and I figure that ties into your environmental.
It definitely does. I think it's a big part of it, and as I said, when I was writing the book, I was doing a lot of things that I think show up in the book in that way. So I've been living for the past decade in a place that is a kind of American edgeland. Edgeland is a term invented by the English ecologist Marion Shord to describe, in the very English context, these places where wild nature bumps up against industrial human development. The place I live is a kind of a great exemplar of the kind of American version of this. It's what was an empty lot on the shores of on the banks of the Colorado River, through which, when I bought the property, an abandoned petroleum pipeline transmission that had been running fuels from a big leaking above ground storage tank farm from the looks like the 1920s through the 1990s, and it's kind of next door to a door factory and a dairy plant and a construction supply warehouse and a bunch of other warehouses around it, in a place where these heavy industrial uses have sort of inadvertently shielded a little section of riverine woodland from any kind of human activity. And I've always been attracted to these places of like these little pockets of interstitial wilderness that still exist in the landscape. I didn't always have a vocabulary for it, but I always had an intuitive draw to it. You know, I grew up in, you know, a kind of, you know, essentially, you know, mid-20th century suburban reality where you could always find these little pockets that hadn't yet been bulldozed over to make room for the new. And this is kind of a much more extreme version of that kind of place that's both in the flight path of the airport, which is a former Air Force base where they used to fly B-52s, you know, over the southern hemisphere south of us. I guess back when I suppose there was some concern about, you know, the potential for a war with our friends to the south. And it's also in the flight path of the Colorado River that runs, you know, we live like half mile downstream from the last dam that holds it in. Between there and the Gulf, 300 miles away, and so it's a place where the uncanny happens, where you'll find, you know, if you'll go into the woods and you have an equal likelihood of running into a coy wolf, like, you know, a blended coyote blended with either a big dog or a wolf, as recently happened to me, or a human transient, you know, who's living in the woods, who's sort of living off of Capitol's register, and a place where time, the operation of time, in the kind of sense of what part of time am I currently in, operates under different rules. A place where you walk down to the river after heavy rains and you'll find, you know, the relics of prehistoric bivalves. You'll find human antiquities. We've found, you know, like 10 things that have been identified by archaeologists as like, you know, 10,000 and 15,000 year old tools. And you'll see, you know, occasionally armed police officers sort of, you know, walking through the middle of the river on horseback. Yeah. Right. And
looking for one of those human transients, probably.
Yeah, but because this is a spot where they put the dam there because these were ancient low water crossings. This is where one of the main low water crossings was for the Chisholm Trail, you know, of John Wayne's, you know, Take 'em to Missouri, Matt, and before that, an Indian trail. And so part of what I've done there has been restoring the landscape of this little plot of land that we bought together with my wife and family, and doing what a lot of people have been doing in the Midwest of taking the kind of scraped prairie and through fire, through you know, a sort of curatorial attention, trying to bring back the landscape that was there, the kind of the biodiversity that was there, and that really is there in the landscape, ready to come back if we just let it. Mm-hmm. So, as I was writing this book, I was also restoring this weedy lot that had been a place where, you know, Texaco and then Chevron would come through every once in a while and fiddle with the valve box. That's where my front door now is. And so now I live in a little greenhouse we built sort of buried in the trench that was left after they took the pipeline out, with a green roof and, you know, 160 different species of plants growing, and all manner of every, you know, the weirdest array of insects and a lot of rare birds that show up, and We even have coral snakes that slither up to the back room door looking for lizards to eat. And there's a redemptive possibility to that I think is somewhat woven into the book.
Certainly, yeah.
And a sense, and similarly, a sense that, I don't know, when you do that and you see how stark the contrast is between the amount of nature that one can experience in a kind of fully developed human landscape, and the amount of wild nature that you can experience when you actively seek out biodiversity and the kind of the cultivation of it and the kind of welcoming of other species into your very own domestic milieu. And that to me is, extremely rewarding and promising undertaking, and one that, makes me very hopeful for the future. I'm also very involved in other kinds of urban ecology projects that this has kind of turned me on to. And I think a lot of people are picking up on these ideas.
I was going to joke, we have the High Line here in Manhattan, which they turned into ecology as tourism and a way to gentrify neighborhoods and drive people out. But
and it is. I was just thinking of the High Line as well. I mean, I think I live in a kind of a High Line-like place, and I think the basic idea now that the High Line is pretty domesticated now. Yeah. But the core idea, the core concept, is right where it's at, and it's almost taking the aesthetic of like post-apocalyptic cinema. Yeah.
I think of Nothing But Flowers by the Talking Heads as that great, everything gets overgrown, which, one of the characters brings up explicitly in the book, just the earth is going to take it back. There's going to be a point at which we're all gone. And, that's when it's
just waiting. Yeah. It's going to take it back. That's right. And the beauty of seeing rogue plants coming up over the concrete is one that I find very attractive.
See, it's nice out where I live. We're only about 25 miles north and west of the city, but because of potential polluting issues with the water table, they banned construction, they banned new sewers, et cetera. So it's already just beyond suburban, and you just can't develop anything. So it's hundreds of yards of woods behind my house that they can't do anything with, leads down to a reservoir. My parents happened to build it 50 years ago at just the right time. But it's one of those things, you can be close to New York. You can have this, this amazing scene, but know that, right outside that, you still manage to have deer and bear and wild turkey, wandering around.
Right.
We capture a little something, and, it's a question of how much of that is, again, treated as an amusement park versus, the greater reality that's actually impinging on human development.
I was talking yesterday with a friend who said that evidently the largest population of peregrine falcons in North America is in New York City.
Could be. Have you ever read The Peregrine?
By J.A. Baker.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
okay. I was assuming, but if you hadn't, I was going to take back the Tom Stoppard and give you that instead. So, I only read it last year for the first time, and that and Area X I was reading almost simultaneously by Vandermeer. So those both kind of warped my brain.
That's an interesting bookend of books about nature suffused with melancholy.
The interesting thing is, I think The Peregrine is more apocalyptic than Vandermeer in some respect.
The story there is that Baker was just dying.
Oh, I didn't know.
As he was writing the book.
Okay, I
didn't know that while I was reading it.
Yeah.
I did read it. I actually read it, I think, as I was working on Tropic of Kansas. And but he was dying of cancer.
Yeah, I knew he died a few years after it came out. So he probably a biography just came out about him, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, I heard about that. I would like to read that myself.
But that was one that really just. It's one of those moments where you realize that there's a much stranger world out here, and things that we see as completely prosaic, but you can find both immense poetic beauty and this absolute apocalyptic vibe. Speaking of Texas.
Yeah.
I would say vis-a-vis the United States versus the United States. What is Texas to you? And how does it relate to the rest of this country? Because everyone I know from Texas has a certain angle about its relationship to the rest of the states, namely that they could secede anytime they want and they would be the 7th largest economy in the world, blah, blah, blah. But that sense of, live and die for America, but we could also secede from America.
Yeah.
At any point.
It's a great question, Gil. And it's one I've been thinking about a lot. It relates to what I'm working on in this new book, and it certainly relates to this book.
Is it okay to ask about a new book? Writers usually hate that. We'll get to it later, but
But Texas is, and what you see in this book here, I think, or the thing that is in this book that really comes more than anything from my experience of living in Texas, is Texas, more than any other part of the U.S., is manifestly colonized territory. That when you live there, if you're doing what I consider paying attention, you see and experience that you're living in colonized space. Fehrenbach, T.R. Fehrenbach, the great both science fiction writer and historian of Texas, but better known for the latter. And he has this great book, Lone Star, which is a history of Texas and the Texans. And he talks about how, I think quite accurately, Texans are the only Americans whose sort of notion of why they're there and how they're there and the place where they are is premised on an unabashed narrative of conquest and pride in that conquest. It's not this utopian
we came here to build a sanctuary,
refugee story of religious persecution, of a kind of biblical redemption and a kind of almost like, a sense of divine anointment as a chosen people. For the Texans, it's sort of like, we got kicked out of the other place. And we came here to this hard scrabble land. And, we kicked out the other people that were here and then suppressed the people that they had already kind of suppressed.
Yeah.
And then we made it rich. And it's a funny thing. Texas is, we've talked about growing up in Iowa. You learn a little Iowa history growing up in Iowa, but it's sort of like unsurprisingly boring. And, there's not a lot of violence,
grand heroics.
Yeah, there's not a lot of heroics. It's like community building, and some people getting kind of crazy in their politics for moments, and then they settle down. Texans have. It's the only state I've ever lived in that has its own creation myth. That has its own indigenous dress, music, cuisine. Even, business culture. And it really is a place that has this kind of sense of being another country. And when you think about it that way, as a science fiction writer, the idea of, this was another country. This was a lot of other countries, in fact, that preceded it, the Six Flags of Texas, and think about all of the, Native American populations that dominated the landscape before that, and so it's an exciting place to think about those kinds of possibilities of what else could there be, what else could there be in the future, what else could there have been in the past, and to think about it that way.
Do you see yourself in a Texan SF writer tradition? Do you put not to elevate where you are in terms of that stuff, but do you see yourself fitting into a certain continuum?
Yeah, absolutely. I became a science fiction writer, really, in Texas. And I read widely among, the
the guys. I don't say the guys, but
a lot of Texas. I've read a lot of Texas writers, both writers of science fiction and writers of literary fiction, Western fiction, and crime fiction. And they're not all guys. I mean, really now Texas is a really a vibrant generator of great women writers of science fiction and fantasy, including, I could just, run down the list just from Austin alone. From Nikki Drayden, who just won the Compton Crook Award for Best First Novel. Amazing African-American woman writer who's native of Houston and lives in Austin, and also published by Harper Voyager. To Stina Light, great fantasy writer, to Martha Wells with her who's out of College Station, who with her like Murderbot Diaries is sort of cleaning up these days with this kind of actually very Texan sort of science fiction. But anyway, while I see myself as part of that community of writers, and there are a lot of things I share with them, I don't self-identify as a Texan. I did for like a couple of years. You bought a pickup and started.
You do have a belt buckle, but
I have a belt buckle. I think my large brass belt buckle with a picture of a couple of raccoons climbing around on a tree branch is that to me is more like is as much of a 70s Midwesterner kind of thing.
Oh, that tableau would be perfectly fine back in northern New Jersey. Honestly, it's one of those, we only put out the trash in the mornings because the raccoons go bananas and try to find everything. They figured out the trash schedule better than the people have, basically.
Well, yeah, the raccoons are rapidly out evolving their country. The urban raccoons are out evolving their country cousins because, among other things, they have to figure out how to get bungee cords off of trash bins.
Right. And if you figure that out and pass it on to the kids, reflecting on the day job stuff, B actually will be how did that, influence what you ended up becoming or who you ended up becoming as a writer. But what prepared you, or did you have any preparation for that experience of proximity to power that you talk about with DC, that you talk about with the boardrooms? I've only started going through it in the last 2 years, really, with my Washington experiences, and it's illuminating to realize what people do versus what they say to retain proximity to power. And while I had pop culture, grounding for this stuff, you don't necessarily believe that's actually how people live, and then you experience it and realize, no, that's exactly how things can be.
It's a really interesting question. I had no preparation for this stuff. I mean, I had.
You were younger also when you went into that world.
I was 18 when I first went. I was doing a gap year between high school and college, and I had an internship, a paid internship with in a Senate office. And I was as green as they come. I mean, I was a gullible Midwesterner, and I probably still am in some ways, as cynical as I am. And
I still tell these guys, I'm just a small timer from New Jersey. I'm just trying to get a good deal for my constituents, but I'm no operator.
Yeah, and so
they fall for that too. I'm sorry. Go on. Yeah.
No. Well, I mean. Yeah, working. I mean, and all of my time in Washington, which I know all told was 5 or 6 years, was spent in the Senate, and the last stint of it was as a lawyer, working as a staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and with floor privileges, which means you're a staffer who is allowed to be present on the Senate floor in the Senate chambers, and you can go into their cloakrooms, and being where you seeing sort of, it's kind of like when you see, what goes on in the newsroom when they don't think that they're live.
Yeah.
It's kind of a little like that. You haven't really, I don't think I would write the kind of science fiction or other works I write if I hadn't had the experience of eating deep dish pizza with Strom Thurmond during the Clarence Thomas hearings, where on the extraordinary part of the Clarence Thomas hearings, where you will those who are old enough may recall it went on. This was over a weekend. It started on a Friday and it went into a Sunday night. And the Sunday night, it was sort of degenerating to where everybody was retreating from the room because it had almost become a kind of a sick self-parody. And so anyway, Strom Thurmond, he looked kind of like, he was like a character. He was like a politician that William Burroughs would invent.
Yeah. See, that's what I'm saying. You meet people who you realize you wouldn't cast in a movie as that politician because it would be too obvious. And then you realize they're real.
Yeah. I mean, I remember sitting there watching those hearings, or maybe, and as a comics nerd, like as a Marvel comics nerd.
Which is something else we can talk about. Yeah.
And thinking, wow, man, Ted Kennedy looks just like the supreme intelligencer. The guy with the giant blocky head where like the jawline is 3 times the width of the crown of the head. And it's just like, and the head itself is so much bigger than any other human head. And, and every one of these guys, they were not only like eccentric personalities, they were like some kind of like Hunter S. Thompson hallucinatory vision of like, freak show versions of politicians, just physically. They were all really, remarkably unusual looking people. And so, that sense of like the potential, like authentic surrealism of something so important and so official as these people deciding, the future of the country and kind of holding the reins, the reins of power in the most august institution of our government.
The deliberative body.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Again, from my side, I deal mainly with staff. I have very little exposure directly to reps and senators. Although I did testify last September. I got called up to testify in front of a health subcommittee for energy and commerce on the House side. And
I'm sorry to hear that. That's almost as bad as that's a lot worse than having to testify in front of a jury or give a deposition.
There was a degree. All I was supposed to do was give a 5-minute statement. My firm down there said, don't worry, we've talked to the congressman. Nobody has any questions for you. They really want to talk to the other guys about this area. And then, of course, they start asking questions of me. I'm like, I will start answering them on the fly and hope to God I don't see anything that, constitutes some sort of, horrible crime, because I live in Kafkaesque fear that, I'm going to be dragged away at any time. That's only been 47 years and it hasn't happened yet. But.
Well, right. And that's when the other thing you realize. So, I'm talking about the centers, but the other thing is like the staffers, and you work there or you go up there for your work, and you're like, holy crap, the country is being run by interns. I mean, it's basically what it's like. I mean, here I was like 27 years old or something, right out of law school. And I'm like in there, like, showing up at meetings with the general counsel of General Electric. Speaking of Jack Welch, where we were working on, I did a lot of work on like whistleblower stuff, and they had a problem, a big one, where a GE executive and an Israeli Air Force general allegedly had created an entirely artificial Air Force base to
send bills. Yeah.
but anyway, the extreme youth of, and inexperience of the people kind of, deciding what information, goes in front of the politicians, and the kind of strange recipe that is for how the laws get made.
Yeah. Off mic, I will share some stories with you. On mic, of course, my life is one long non-disclosure agreement. So I don't tell any stories, but
that's really true of all of American life these days, I think.
Most people tend to share far more than they should. I've found my biggest lesson in since I moved into this role, better to keep your mouth shut. Let other people show what they know and don't know. It's a lot better to keep quiet. The flip side is it keeps me from writing anything really substantive, because, I'm always restraining instead of amplifying.
Right.
When we met, you were on a panel with John Crowley, Samuel Delaney, Ellen Datlow, and a few other writers. Did you feel like you fit? Did you feel like you'd arrived in some respects? Did you feel like you belonged?
I mean, yeah, I feel comfortable having a conversation with all of those folks, and several of them were people I consider friends, Ellen, Siobhan Carroll, and the host. I mean, I don't know if I ever feel like I really fit in as a science fiction writer.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I definitely feel like I am a science fiction writer, that the things I'm writing are informed by reading science fiction. But where the commonalities are with any, other writer, I don't know. I mean, I think I sometimes go to these things and feel like I'm a sidekick at a superhero convention. That's the experience when you're sort of coming up. I had one of those in Mexico like 10 years ago. And I was like, oh, holy moly, what am I doing here? But it's fun. I mean, like, yeah, being around somebody like Delaney, when you're around these people that you read as a kid, it's a fantastic experience. And it's one of the wonderful things about working in a field like this is that if you work at it, you're very likely, if you just actively participate in it, you're very likely to have encounters with people. And, and as somebody who, I can remember, reading Dahlgren on the bus, across the Midwestern town where I was growing up, having it melt my brain out the window. To then be sitting there, making that guy laugh, that's a pretty invigorating experience. Right?
You just don't tell him you read the book, because I've known Chip for about 20 years now. He'll ask what you thought of it. He's, as all writers are, insecure enough that he's still concerned about what you thought of his book that sold millions of copies and is seen as one of the most influential
I think
books of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think that's true of all writers. I mean, I've been an early reader for a lot of writers, and you can tell even the people that, you think of as the sort of the paragons of achievement in the field, they all have the same, they go through the same things that I think inhere in the craft, and that are what produces good stuff, which is worrying about whether it's any good or not.
Did you read Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson books?
I've never read those.
Okay, because I have a feeling the idea of power, Texas, and literature kind of coalesce around those. And I haven't read them yet either, except for the introduction to his first one. But I have a feeling it might be one of the lifetime transformative things for either of us, if we ever get around to it.
I've always heard amazing things about it. I live in the heart of LBJ country, at the edge of the Ladybird Johnson Ladybird Lake and the Ladybird Johnson wildflower trails along it, and the kind of former military space that's like right where I live. That's all stuff that was brought to Central Texas by LBJ when he was in Congress. And the University of Texas and its current power as an institution is to a large extent a function of defense money that, I wouldn't have been, they came to Austin. I wouldn't be in Austin if it hadn't been for the kind of the technology boom there, all of which is ultimately fueled by the defense boom. So I sort of have an indirect sense of it. But no, I never read the Caro books, which are, really supposed to be kind of seminal political biographies.
His Robert Moses one is essentially Shakespeare for the 20th century America. In terms of understanding power and what it does to people and the world around them. Yeah,
the book on that theme, nonfiction book on that theme that has had the most impact on me is a book called What It Takes by Richard Ben Kramer, who was I think an Esquire writer. And this was a book, must have come out around 1990 or something, but it was a profile of 8 of the candidates who ran for president in 1988. And it includes George Herbert Walker Bush, going to Texas with only a few $1 million in the bank to start a business. It includes, figures like Bob Dole, the sort of seminal Midwest, laconic Midwesterner in his narrative, coming back from World War II after having been, brutally maimed in Anzio and not having access to any kind of physical therapy. And hanging his bum right arm from the armature of his parents' garage door opener and trying to make it work again. Or Joe Biden, my technically my old boss, I guess, when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, growing up in Delaware and Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner, with a horrible, horrible stutter and stammer and no access to speech therapy, who just decided through sheer act of, juvenile will that he was going to figure out how to talk more and better and longer than anybody else. And produced the guy who used to have Spy Magazine, doing full-page Joe Biden sentence diagrams. And reading about the backstories of these same bizarre figures that dominate our politics today, that's really illuminating too, as a way of kind of thinking about the extent to which very real American character and some of its more exceptional examples in the lives of certain Americans dominates the life of the community. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things that writing this book that I ended up doing after I realized early on that the characters, the kind of the core characters that I was developing to drive the story, all tied into certain archetypes from American folklore. Mm-hmm. And, when you read these political biographies, they're also, in a way, they're like non-fictional versions of American folklore. I was thinking today about the figure that's so well described by Constance Rourke in her book American Humor, which is a history of American folklore written in the 1930s that New York Review Books republished, a while back. And, the Yankee Peddler is the kind of the prototypical American, like, proto-capitalist trickster, the con man who shows up in town with, all the shiny trinkets to sell the locals, literally the pots and pans of the original peddler who goes into the southern town, or the Duke figure in Doonesbury, or the music man Harold Hill, right?
You could say the monorail guy from The Simpsons. It's okay.
Yeah.
That's
Or you could say, the current occupant of the White House. I mean, he fits right into that kind of mold. And I don't know. So I think those stories are rich. There's a truism among writers of fiction and among screenwriters that the kind of the lodestone for narrative archetyping is, like Greco-Roman kind of classical mythology or the mythos of the world. But there's this rich repository of stuff right here of American folklore that and tall tales and true tales that you can mine, and I tried to mine a lot of that in this book.
And the next book?
The next book, the working title is Rule of Capture, and it's a lawyer story at its heart. It's an effort to take the material of the legal thriller and push it through a dystopian lens, or through at least a speculative counterfactual lens. The elevator pitch on which I sold this was Better Call Saul meets 1984. And it's about a criminal defense lawyer in the United States that's sort of drifting into totalitarianism. Sort of nominally set in the same universe as Tropic of Kansas, but pretty well uncoupled from it. And an opportunity to try to deal with some similar themes, but maybe in a kind of more urban vein, if you will, around, how the society really works, how justice really works, sort of, imagining a lawyer whose clients are all guilty, but the crimes of which they're guilty are unjust.
Going back to our Greek
archetypes. Yeah, absolutely. So this is more kind of, tracking into material from the classics. Think of things like the Oresteia by Aeschylus, and kind of the idea, which is really a story about how the justice system comes to exist in the first place, in my opinion, and or in my reading, and thinking about, esoteric things like, the very Texan implementations of, the idea of Anglo-American property law, of that idea of the American landscape, and particularly the Texas landscape, as colonized space, informed by things like learning from my neighbors, my Chicano neighbors, how many of them self-identified as, indigenous peoples, and just sort of one of those things that was so obvious once it was drawn to my attention by new friends, and but that as a Midwesterner I had never really been exposed to. Of people telling family stories of, how and when and how many generations ago they adopted Hispanic surnames to try to blend into the population, to not be persecuted. Anyway, so in one set, and the very, crazy mixed up city of Houston, Texas, as its sort of starting point.
Which is one of the cities I've never visited outside of flying through it once. But I've had a Dallas experience. I've had a bunch of San Antonio, but Houston's just a void for me.
It's a crazy city. I mean, it's a place that's both, it's like ground zero of extraction capitalism for the whole planet in a way. And in some ways, like, crazily conservative, but also this, like, unbelievably diverse city. I mean, in some ways more diverse than New York, it feels like. And one where all of that diversity is given, great freedom to express itself through, among other things, the complete absence of zoning, and the one that produces, all manner of amazing kind of creative output from, like, great writers like Donald Bartleby and Larry McMurtry to, musicians from Beyonce to ZZ Top, to some of, the really most interesting, like, free jazz and, like, avant-garde electronic music and hip hop people. And so trying to play with some of those energies is part of what I'm doing with that book.
I look forward to seeing it.
Thank you.
Fundamentally optimistic? Or are you really fundamentally apocalyptic and half the population needs to die before things can, start to ease up?
I would say, my good friend Bruce Sterling, who I consider a mentor, says that he's neither a pessimist nor an optimist, because he feels like either one of those is just putting a hand over one eye, right? And I'm sure he's not the only one who said that. I would say I'm sort of fundamentally cynical about humanity, and fundamentally optimistic about nature. And ultimately, we're part of nature, and so I suppose that makes me sort of optimistic in the long view. Yeah. But I think we have some treacherous territory to go through to get there. And I'm writing right now dystopian novels, partly because I'm really trying to find my way, as I sort of mentioned earlier, to if not a utopian place, to
an anti-dystopia.
Or an authentic vision of what a better future could look like. One that's trying to draw on a kind of speculative realism or a dystopian realism of sort of prism through which to look at the present, to try to find our way to the light. That I think is always something that dystopian novels are trying to do, and the more dystopian it is, the more you want that character to escape. I mean, I've just been watching, I don't watch a lot of television, but we've been watching the Hulu adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale, and you see it there, how much you want this core protagonist, June/Offred, to escape from that realm. And if the dystopia is well constructed, and its kind of counterfactual critique of how the society works, or how it expresses an aspect of how the society in which we live kind of wants to be, it can perform, I think, a really healthy and rigorous sort of political and social function of, like, oh yeah, and why does that problem exist, and how do we get out of there? And both, not just in the practical way of how do we, how does so-and-so escape the city in which she is,
but how do we? Yeah. I get you. Christopher Brown, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Gil.
And that was Christopher Brown. His first novel is Tropic of Kansas from Harper Voyager. I enjoyed it a lot for reasons that I think came up during our conversation. Now, Chris's website is ChristopherBrown.com, all spelled just like it should be. It's a neat site with links to a lot of his writing and some of his past appearances and some TV stuff he's done, along with some of his photography. And to see more of his pictures, and you really should visit his Instagram feed, which is ebitdata, which I'm taking to be a business joke. But anyway, it's EBITDADA. It's mainly nature photography, and a lot of it is just haunting. It's some really beautiful stuff. He's also on Twitter as NB_Chris, which is worth checking out also. That's N as in Nancy, NB_Chris. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Chris, so, who are you reading? So if you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The newest episode of that one features 40 minutes of new material from the likes of Dave McKean, Paul Karasik, Mark Newgarden, Seymour Quast, John Leland, Ann Hulbert, Henry Wessels, Lauren Weinstein, Jerry Beck, Willard Spiegelman, Levi Tadar, Jesse Scheidlauer, and Robert Weil. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project that I haven't done any work on, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode as part of the Batshit Crazy 4 Podcasts in 3 Boroughs Day. Chris was the third guest and the first of 2 in Manhattan. The whole day involved a bunch of toll bridges, about $16 in parking, 2 subway trips, and a lot of driving, along with some coffee breaks. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee breaks, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Michael Hacker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasik, Michael Janizik, and Stephen Solomon for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. I haven't decided who next week's guest will be. Might be Alberto Manguel, might be Irvin Unger, could be Dave Calver, Chris Reynolds, David Lloyd. It's good to have choices. I'll probably go with Irv now that I think about it, but you better come back next week and find out. Till then, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. keep it that way.